In the first part, we talked about the need to distinguish ourselves as scientifically trained psychologists from other approaches to explaining human behavior, such as astrology, for example. And we talked about the role of the scientific process in that, and we talked about how within that process an interpretation bias could occur, especially in psychological science, because of the fact that method-relevant beliefs are very peripheral and theory-relevant beliefs are perhaps too central. And one of the factors, and we talked about 3 factors that could exacerbate that problem. First of all, an over-reliance on conceptual replication. Second of all, the way in which we test statistical hypotheses with null hypothesis significance testing. And a third issue was related to measurement. Lack of proper attention for how we measure stuff. So insufficient attention to verifying the integrity of measurement instruments and experimental procedure, which is basically what we're going to talk about in this final part of the lecture. Because it's easier to spot the difficulties with claiming that you've observed precognition if you've observed a deviation from chance on a weird computer task. But it's perhaps more difficult to, critically reflect on the connection between the stuff we're supposedly measuring, the unobserved construct, and the measurements we use to spot it. So, ideally, those measurement procedures are well designed and properly and precisely described, so they allow us to make inferences, clear inferences about unobserved psychological processes. Sometimes that is in a what people might describe a more direct manner, sometimes in a more indirect manner. But you could argue both ways, whether survey questionnaires, for example, are a more direct way of measuring attitudes compared to using reaction time measures or even brain activity. But these are popular ways of doing measurements. These are also the tools that get wielded in the popular media as the Excaliburs of science, right? So survey shows that this and this is the case, or neurological research shows that such and such is the case, and or from a measure of your unconscious attitude, we can conclude that such and such is the case. So I've selected 3 measurement procedures, if you will, from psychology that you see a lot in the popular press as well, and about which a lot of misconceptions exist, mostly among the lay public, but sometimes there's also discussion points among researchers themselves. So let's start with responses to survey questions. And again, we're talking about properly making an inference from the actual measurement, so the response of participants on a survey question in this case, and the stuff we're trying to measure with those questions, the underlying attitude. I'm going to start with a silly example to get you going. This is about basically the context sensitivity of survey measurement. All right. So again, as I said, a silly example, but I think it summarizes why we cannot generalize from responses on an opinion poll to the underlying actual real attitude of people, because those measurements are context sensitive, as we've shown, right? The way in which and the order in which we ask the questions has an influence on the results we get. And that's this is a less silly example from 2013. So this is an English translation of a message in the press from the PVV, the party in the Netherlands, from Geert Wilders, who responds, in which the leader of the party responds to opinion poll, and basically is claiming that from that poll he can say that, well, the average Dutch person has had enough of Islam. And basically he bases that on a poll which asked the following 6 questions. The poll was commissioned, by the way, by the same political party. So that's an interesting detail in and of itself. And the poll asked the following questions. First of all, do you think Islam is an enrichment for the Netherlands? Do you think immigration from Islamic countries to the Netherlands should be stopped? Do you think that the building of new mosques in the Netherlands should be stopped? Do you think there's a relationship between the Islam and the recent acts of terror in Boston, London, and Paris? How do you judge the likelihood of those acts occurring in the Netherlands? And then question C, do you agree or disagree with the question, there is enough Islam in the Netherlands by now? So, a majority of people indicated, yes, there is enough Islam in the Netherlands by now. Do you see any issues with concluding from this that the Netherlands has had enough of Islam? So because most people say yes to question 6C, Geert Wilder says the Netherlands has had enough of Islam. Would you agree that that's likely the case on the basis of this measurement?
But you can interpret the question in two ways, can you not? So you could interpret it as, do you think there's enough inclusion of Islam within the culture?
Mm-hmm.
Or the way he interprets it, which would be that people have enough of Islam.
Well, yes, at least two ways in which you could interpret it. There's even a third way. I mean, I didn't even think of the first one you mentioned, but that's a valid interpretation as well of this question. Is there enough? Is there enough inclusion? Is there enough? It should stop now, right? It's complete, or a package of Islam-related stuff in the Netherlands, and perhaps even the one that Geert Wilders mentioned, the Netherlands has had enough of Islam. But I would say that third interpretation is a bit dubious, right? Saying that you have enough of something doesn't mean that you've had enough of it, right? If I were to claim that I have enough money, that doesn't mean that I'm basically sick of money, right? It's not the same thing. So indeed, that is a very ambiguous question. So that shows us the subjectiveness of survey research, right? So it's your interpretation of a question that steers both your interpretation as a participant in research as well as the person setting up the survey questions. Something else that you noticed?
He's trying to link through the first question, sort of question like, do you think there's a relationship between Islam and the recent acts of terror? He tries to link into people's heads the two constructs basically of a religion and the terror act, and then goes further to like, do you think how likely are those terror acts? So make them basically afraid of that, and because he linked it before to the Islam, people are probably more likely answering the other questions with having the construct of terror in their head when answering questions about Islam. So it's like priming them basically.
Exactly.
I was just saying, I feel like the entire questionnaire is still shit.
Yes.
Like, you could analyze each question for itself and be like, yeah, okay, it comes from a person that's already biased, inserting an idea to the person giving the answer, that there might be a valid truth within the question, which is definitely not.
Yes, indeed. And we're trying to specify why, if you had to put a more specific label on why we consider the questionnaire to be shit, is well, the context sensitivity, right? So basically the order of questions influences the type of answers people give to the questions at the end of the questionnaire, even if that question would have been more phrased more specifically, but it's very ambiguous as it is. So we've seen two examples: the ambiguity of questions combined with the subjectivity of both the researcher and the respondent make for results that are very difficult to interpret. All right, so well, basically this just orders stuff we've talked about, right? So surveys are subjective, no shocking news there, but it does make that for a context-sensitive measurement as well. It's on the basis of the interpretation of the respondent of the question, which again is dependent on the intentions and the interpretation of language by the researcher. And we need psychometrics for being able to draw stronger conclusions, to move from that measurement level to that construct level, which is what we're talking about so far. Such as retest reliability, internal consistency, predictive validity, and construct validity. These have all been covered in the PTPR course, right? At the beginning, I hope. In the first year. Right, okay. But there's another thing that you might need to watch out for when using surveys. It has to do with that subjectivity. It is related to that, but it might not have been. You might not be able to detect it directly if you're just looking at internal consistency of a questionnaire. I'll give you 2 examples. First of all, there's research from Hapala et al., and they found a positive correlation between self-reported physical activity and literacy numeracy, which were derived from school tests. Can you then conclude that you should encourage your child to exercise, as this banner does? Because physical exercise does not only make your child strong, but also makes your kid smart, because exercise increases the flow of blood to the brain and builds new brain cells. I hope that you spot that, of course, we can derive any causal conclusions on the basis of this correlation, right? So that should be your first instinct, basically, when looking at these results. But there's another thing that might be going on here as well, which is conflation. And conflation means basically we're conflating 2 different measurements. We're thinking we're measuring 2 different things, but we're actually tapping into the same underlying construct. So ideally, what the researcher wants to show us here is that we measure exercise level of an individual using self-reported physical activity, and we measure something else by looking at the literacy and numeracy test, which reflect the literacy and numeracy skills of the individual. And if you then see that those 2 are correlated, that might mean that one is causing the other or the other way around. But it could just be the case that people that are better at literacy and numeracy tests, or have better underlying literacy and numeracy skills, are better at interpreting the actual questions and keeping track of their daily physical activity than people who would score lower on their numeracy skills. So the 2 variables become conflated, and it's difficult to see to what extent we're actually measuring 2 different things with 2 different types of measures, or we're actually tapping into the same underlying construct. And the fact that you would then find a correlation between these 2 measures is not that interesting and does not point towards a causal relationship. It might not even point towards an interesting relationship between 2 variables, because we're actually talking about the same underlying construct. And in the instance that we're interpreting a strong correlation between 2 similar variables as being interesting because they might potentially influence each other, right? But what's actually the case is that there are 2 different ways of asking questions about the same underlying construct. The problem we call conflation in this case. Another example, which is perhaps more intuitive and even more clear than the previous one, research from Cohn et al. Found a positive relationship between positive emotion and life satisfaction. And you think that's interesting, right? It's basically cannon fodder for magazines and saying, well, you should have a more positive outlook on life, or you should just smile a lot in the mirror when you wake up, because that would make for more life satisfaction, or whatever the underlying causal connections are between the 2. But if you then look at the actual measurements that were used for measuring positive emotion and life satisfaction, I think it's more likely that we're dealing with conflation here. So positive emotion was measured by asking participants about their feelings of contentment, gratitude, and joy. And life satisfaction was measured using a scale containing 5 statements like, so far I've gotten the important things that I want in life. The conditions of my life are excellent. And if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. So I would be hard pressed to spot the difference between measuring contentment and whatever the response to the questions about living your life over measures, right? I think it's likely that contentment taps into the answer to the question, if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. So basically, again, the researchers are assuming that with self-reported feelings of contentment, we're just measuring positive emotions, which is different from the construct of life satisfaction, which we measure with self-reported satisfaction. I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing. But it's not unthinkable that we're actually measuring the same thing, general contentment, right? Which you can measure with these type of questions and those type of questions, but they're basically both determined by the same underlying construct. So the fact that you think you found an interesting positive correlation between positive emotion and life satisfaction might just be due to you just having constructed two types of questions which basically measure the same thing. Which is what we call conflation, which is another issue that you could relate specifically to doing survey research, which is specifically tied to the reasoning steps we take from the measurement level to the construct level. And beyond all the stuff that you're already familiar with in terms of validity and reliability, we've also talked about the need for clearly defined concepts, right? To make sure that we don't make that error of conflation. All right. The upside of a survey questionnaire is that it has some face validity, right? At the look of it, it seems likely that asking people these type of questions has something to do with life satisfaction. That's not always the case with different types of measurements we use, such as an IAT or fMRI study. And especially in those cases, it's important that you argue what the relationship is between the underlying attitude or the stuff you're trying to measure and the measurement level.